What if I told you that one of the safest places for a woman in the Middle Ages was also one of the most dangerous? Behind towering stone walls, behind whispered prayers, behind vows of purity and obedience, there were screams no one was allowed to hear. For centuries, medieval convents were seen as holy sanctuaries, places of peace, devotion, and protection. But hidden behind locked gates was a world of fear, control, and silence. Tonight, we uncover what really happened inside medieval convents. Stories buried for hundreds of years. Stories the Church never wanted told. In medieval Europe, few places inspired as much respect as a convent. To the outside world, convents were sacred spaces, homes of prayer, discipline, and spiritual purity. Stone buildings rising above towns like symbols of heaven on earth. Parents believed their daughters would be safe there, protected from violence, protected from temptation, protected from the harsh realities of medieval life. Inside these walls, people imagined peaceful days filled with prayer, singing hymns, and quiet reflection. But this image was carefully constructed, because in reality, convents were not just religious spaces, they were institutions of power, and power, when left unchecked, can become dangerous. Most people don't realize this, but medieval convents were often completely sealed off from society. Once a woman entered, the gates closed behind her. In many cases, they never opened again. No visitors without permission, no contact with the outside world, no voice that could reach beyond those walls. What happened inside stayed inside, and that secrecy allowed dark truths to grow. Because a convent was not just a place of prayer, it was a place where human emotions, fear, desire, anger, loneliness were pushed down, denied, and punished. And when those emotions had nowhere to go, they often exploded in destructive ways. To understand how this happened, we first need to understand why girls were sent to convents in the first place, because for many of them, entering a convent was not a choice. In the Middle Ages, a woman's life was rarely her own. From the moment she was born, her future was decided by others, by her family, her social class, and her economic value. Marriage required a dowry, and dowries were expensive. For poor families, a convent was often the cheaper option. Instead of paying for marriage, parents could give their daughter to the church, sometimes along with a small donation, and be free of responsibility. And so thousands of girls were sent away, not because they wanted to serve God, but because their families had no other option. Some girls were as young as 7 or 8 years old, too young to understand vows, too young to understand celibacy, too young to understand what they were losing. Others were teenagers who resisted, cried, begged to stay home, only to be told this was God's will. Once inside the convent, these girls were expected to take vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity forever. There was no return policy, no second chance. Refusing to take vows was seen as rebellion, not just against the church, but against God himself. And rebellion came with consequences. Girls who resisted were punished, locked in isolation cells, denied food, publicly shamed in front of other nuns. Their will was slowly broken. Imagine a young girl taken from her family, stripped of her identity, told that her thoughts were sinful, her body was dangerous, and her silence was holy. This was not spiritual freedom. This was control. And once the gates closed, the outside world forgot them, because society believed convents were holy places, and holy places were not questioned. Life inside a medieval convent was strict, exhausting, and unforgiving. Every day began before sunrise, with the sound of bells echoing through cold stone halls. Sleep was short. Silence was mandatory. The nuns rose in darkness to pray, not once, but many times a day. Prayer was not peaceful meditation. It was rigid, timed, demanded. Between prayers, there was work, hard labor, cooking, cleaning, farming, sewing, copying manuscripts, often for long hours with little rest. Food was simple and scarce. Fasting was common. Hunger was encouraged because suffering, they were told, brought them closer to God. Warmth was rare. Many convent cells were small, damp, and unheated. Winters were brutal, and silence ruled everything. Some convents enforced strict silence rules, no talking except during prayer. Imagine living years, sometimes decades, without conversation, without laughter, without comfort. Loneliness became a constant companion. But the physical hardship was only part of the story. The real control came through fear. Fear of sin, fear of punishment, fear of eternal damnation. Nuns were taught to constantly examine their thoughts. A moment of doubt was sin. A feeling of attraction was sin. Anger, sadness, curiosity, all signs of spiritual weakness. Confession was mandatory and frequent. Every thought had to be spoken aloud, often to male priests who held absolute authority over them, and those confessions could later be used against them. Discipline inside convents was harsh. Mistakes were punished publicly. Shame was used as a teaching tool. Isolation cells, small dark rooms, were common punishments for disobedience. Some nuns were locked away for days, others for weeks. No light, no voices, just silence and prayer. Over time, many women began to break mentally. Some were labeled possessed, others unstable, but the truth was simpler. They were human beings pushed beyond their limits. And this system, built on silence, fear, and absolute authority, created the perfect environment for abuse. Because when no one's watching, when no one's listening, power can do terrible things. And in the next part of this story, we will uncover how that power was used and how the Church's darkest secrets began to take shape behind convent walls. Inside medieval convents, power did not belong to the women who lived there. It belonged to the Church. At the top of the convent hierarchy stood the abbess, the woman responsible for discipline, order, and obedience. But above her stood male clergy, bishops, confessors, and church officials who held absolute authority. There were no inspections, no outside oversight, no one to question their decisions. What happened inside a convent rarely reached the outside world, and when it did, it was usually ignored. Because questioning the Church was dangerous. Obedience was not just expected, it was sacred. Nuns were taught that disobedience was a sin against God Himself. To question authority was to risk eternal damnation, and so silence became a rule. Not just silence of the voice, but silence of the mind. Confession played a powerful role in this system. Nuns were required to confess regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily. They confessed not only actions, but thoughts, doubts, desires, fears. These confessions were supposed to cleanse the soul, but in reality, they created total vulnerability. Priests knew every secret, every weakness, every fear. And secrets are power. A nun who spoke out could be accused of sin, pride, or heresy. Her confessions could be used to discredit her. If she claimed abuse, she could be labeled unstable, or worse, possessed. Because in the medieval world, a woman's word meant little, and a holy man's word meant everything. This imbalance allowed control to become cruelty. Punishments were severe and humiliating. Public shaming, forced fasting, isolation. Some nuns were made to lie face down on cold stone floors for hours as punishment. Others were locked away in tiny cells with barely enough space to stand. And the most terrifying punishment of all was being erased. A nun could simply disappear, transferred, locked away, or declared dead in the records. No one outside would ever know. And in this environment of unchecked authority, silence, and fear, human boundaries began to collapse. Medieval convents demanded absolute celibacy. No love, no relationships, no desire. But celibacy does not erase human nature, it only buries it. Inside convent walls, emotional isolation was extreme. Young women lived together, cut off from the world, under constant pressure and fear. And in that isolation, forbidden relationships began to form. Some were emotional, some were physical. Relationships between nuns were officially condemned, but they were also quietly ignored in many places, as long as secrecy remained. But the most dangerous relationships were those between nuns and priests. Priests held power over confession, punishment, and spiritual judgment. They were trusted absolutely, and some abused that trust. Confession, meant to be sacred, became a tool of manipulation. A priest could convince a nun that her body was sinful and that only obedience to him could save her soul. Some were told their suffering was God's will, that submission was holiness, and in some cases, these relationships resulted in pregnancy. A pregnant nun was a scandal, a disaster, proof that the system had failed, and the Church could not allow that. Historical records suggest that pregnant nuns were often hidden away. Some were forced to give birth in secret. Others were accused of immorality and punished severely. There are disturbing accounts of infants being taken away, their fates unknown. In some regions, rumors spread of newborns buried in convent grounds. Small bones discovered centuries later suggest these rumors were not always false. When scandals became public, the Church acted quickly, not to protect the women, but to protect its reputation. Records were destroyed, witnesses silenced, blame shifted. The narrative was always the same. The woman was sinful, the woman was weak, the institution was holy. And so the cycle continued. This is the part of the story that remained hidden the longest, because it was the hardest to face. Sexual abuse inside medieval convents was rarely documented openly, but when fragments of truth survived, they revealed something deeply disturbing. Some priests used spiritual authority to justify abuse. They told nuns that her obedience to them was obedience to God, that refusing them was sinful, that suffering brought spiritual reward. Young women, already taught to distrust their own thoughts and bodies, were trapped. If they resisted, they were punished. If they spoke out, they were disbelieved. And if they stayed silent, the abuse continued. Victims had nowhere to go. They could not leave. They could not tell their families. They could not appeal to higher authority, because higher authority was often responsible. Some nuns attempted to resist in subtle ways, feigning illness, pretending madness, sabotaging themselves to avoid attention. Others broke completely. Mental breakdowns were common, hallucinations, self-harm, extreme fasting. Rather than seeing these as cries for help, the Church often labeled them as signs of possession. Exorcisms were performed, punishments increased, and the real cause, abuse, remained unspoken. Occasionally, scandals did escape the walls. Whistleblowers, often reformers or former clergy, accused convents of corruption, immorality, and abuse. But these voices were dangerous, and dangerous voices were silenced. Excommunication, imprisonment, execution in extreme cases. The Church's power was vast, and its secrets were protected. For centuries, these stories were buried, dismissed as rumors, or erased entirely. But the suffering was real. Thousands of women lived and died behind convent walls, their pain never acknowledged, their voices never heard. And yet, history has a way of resurfacing what was buried. In the next part of this story, we will uncover the punishments that broke bodies and minds, the scandals that finally exposed the truth, and the women who dared to resist. When obedience failed, punishment followed. Inside medieval convents, discipline was not gentle correction. It was designed to break resistance. Punishment took many forms, some visible, others hidden deep within stone walls. Public punishment was meant to shame. A nun accused of disobedience might be forced to kneel for hours during prayer. Others were ordered to eat on the floor like animals. Some were stripped of their habits, their religious identity, while others watched in silence. But the worst punishments were private. Isolation cells, known in some places as penitence chambers, were small, dark rooms with barely enough space to sit or lie down. Some had no windows. Some had no light at all. A nun could be locked inside for days, sometimes weeks. Silence pressed in from every direction. No voices, no comfort, only prayer and fear. Food was often reduced or removed entirely. Hunger was considered a tool of spiritual correction. Cold was another weapon. Many convents were built of stone, unheated, damp year-round. In winter, punishment cells became freezing chambers. Over time, these conditions took a terrible toll. Women began to break. Some stopped speaking. Others cried uncontrollably. Some began seeing visions. Rather than seeing this as trauma, the Church often explained it as spiritual weakness, or worse, demonic possession. Exorcisms were performed. Rituals meant to drive out evil instead deepened the suffering. The more a woman resisted, the harsher the punishment became. And for some, punishment never ended. There are records of nuns who spent years in isolation, forgotten by the world outside. Their names vanished from documents, their lives erased quietly. And yet, even in this darkness, truth has a way of surviving. Despite the Church's power, some secrets refused to stay buried. Throughout medieval Europe, whispers began to spread. Rumors of corruption, rumors of abuse, rumors of children born and vanished inside convent walls. At first, these stories were dismissed as lies, but over time, evidence began to appear. In some regions, church investigations, meant to silence rumors, did the opposite. Inspectors found locked cells, starving nuns, unexplained deaths. In rare cases, testimonies survived. Former nuns who escaped spoke of cruelty and fear. Reformers recorded accounts of immoral behavior by clergy. One scandal could shake an entire town. Another could bring royal attention. But the Church was skilled at damage control. When abuse was undeniable, blame was redirected. A single corrupt priest, a fallen abbess, a morally weak convent. The system itself was never questioned. Punishments were often symbolic. A priest transferred, a convent reorganized, records sealed or destroyed. But not all scandals could be contained. By the late medieval period, criticism of monastic life was growing louder. Writers, theologians, and reformers began questioning the morality of sealed religious institutions. They asked dangerous questions. What happens when power goes unchecked? What happens when silence is enforced? What happens when faith is used to control rather than protect? These questions terrified the Church. Because once people started questioning convents, they started questioning everything. For centuries, convent walls seemed unbreakable, but pressure was building, and eventually, those walls began to crack. Some nuns resisted quietly. They shared forbidden conversations. They protected each other. They hid the weak and the broken from punishment when they could. Others resisted more boldly.
A small number escaped. Escaping a convent was incredibly dangerous. Leaving without permission meant excommunication, a spiritual death sentence in medieval society. But some women chose freedom over fear. They climbed walls, slipped out during deliveries, fled during wars or plagues. Their stories rarely ended happily. Former nuns were often homeless, hunted, or forced into hiding. But their voices mattered, because they told the truth. As Europe entered the late medieval period, massive change arrived. The Protestant Reformation challenged the authority of the Catholic Church itself. Reformers accused the Church of corruption, secrecy, and abuse. Convents became targets of investigation and closure. In some regions, convents were shut down entirely. In others, they were reformed, opened to oversight, or stripped of absolute power. For the first time, the Church faced public accountability, and what investigators found shocked the world. Locked cells, hidden rooms, unmarked graves. Suddenly, stories once dismissed as lies felt disturbingly real. The Church responded quickly. Some reforms were genuine, rules improved, oversight increased. Others were strategic, meant to restore trust without revealing too much. History books were rewritten, records disappeared, narratives softened. The darkest details faded from memory, but they were never fully erased because suffering leaves traces. In stone walls, in forgotten graves, in scattered documents waiting to be rediscovered. And in the next part of this story, we'll explore how the Church attempted to bury this history, how modern discoveries have begun to uncover it again, and why these stories matter more today than ever before.
When the walls began to crack, the Church did what powerful institutions have always done. It protected itself. As scandals emerged and criticism grew, Church leaders moved quickly, not to expose the full truth, but to control the narrative. Records vanished. Documents detailing abuse, punishment, and misconduct were quietly removed from archives or destroyed entirely. Some were rewritten, others were sealed for centuries. In official histories, convents were described as peaceful places of devotion. Isolated incidents of abuse were blamed on bad individuals, never on the system itself. The message was clear. The institution was holy. The problem was human weakness. Accusers were discredited. Women who spoke out were labeled unstable, sinful, or driven by pride. Their testimonies were dismissed as exaggerations or lies. Even reform-minded church officials often chose silence, because revealing the full truth would mean admitting something terrifying, that the system itself had failed, that holiness had been used as a shield for cruelty, that obedience had been weaponized, that faith had been turned into control. So history was cleaned. Textbooks softened language. Sermons avoided uncomfortable topics. Generations grew up never knowing what had happened behind convent walls. For centuries, the silence worked, until modern history began asking questions the past could no longer answer. In recent centuries, historians began returning to old archives, forgotten letters, hidden court records, private diaries, and slowly, a different story emerged. Archaeologists uncovered unmarked graves near former convents, small skeletons buried without ceremony, human remains that did not match official burial records. Historians compared testimonies across regions, France, England, Italy, Spain, and found disturbing patterns. Isolation cells described in different countries, identical punishments recorded by unrelated sources, the same language used to silence women again and again. What once seemed rumor now looked systemic. Not every convent was abusive, not every priest was cruel, but enough evidence existed to prove one thing clearly.
Abuse inside medieval convents was not rare, it was enabled. Modern scholars began reframing convent history not as purely spiritual sanctuaries, but as power structures operating in a world with no accountability. And that realization changed everything, because it forced historians and the public to confront an uncomfortable truth, that suffering can exist even in places meant to represent goodness, that faith without accountability can become dangerous, and that silence is often the strongest ally of abuse. These discoveries also gave voice to women who had been erased, women whose pain had been dismissed, women whose lives had been reduced to footnotes or removed entirely. Their stories mattered, not just as history, but as warning. Behind every record, behind every ruined stone cell, behind every forgotten grave, there was a human life. A young girl sent away because her family had no money. A woman who never chose a vow she was forced to keep. A voice silenced because it threatened authority. Many entered convents seeking safety. Others were sent against their will. Few ever left unchanged. Some lost their freedom. Some lost their sanity. Some lost their lives. And yet, for centuries, they were remembered only as nuns, not as daughters, not as individuals, not as victims. This story is not about attacking faith. It is about separating faith from power, because belief, at its best, offers comfort and hope. But institutions, when shielded from accountability, can betray the very values they claim to protect. The women inside medieval convents were not weak. They survived hunger, isolation, fear, and silence. Some resisted quietly. Some escaped. Some simply endured. And their endurance deserves to be remembered. History is not just about kings, wars, and empires. It is also about those locked behind walls, whose stories were never meant to be told, until now. The stone walls of medieval convents still stand in many places today, silent, impressive, beautiful. But stones remember. They remember prayers whispered in fear. They remember footsteps pacing isolation cells. They remember voices that were never allowed to speak. And the question history leaves us with is not just what happened then, but what happens when we choose not to listen now. Because the darkest secrets do not survive through evil alone. They survive through silence.